My name is Reverend Barbara Meyers. I am a Unitarian Universalist community minister. My diagnosis is depression. I first had mental health difficulties after the birth of my daughter, with what I now understand is postpartum depression. I became sadder and more deeply disturbed and came to a point where I couldn't sleep. I didn't think I was good for anything, and I became suicidal. At that point, my husband took me to the local hospital where I was admitted to the psychiatric ward. I was in the hospital for about 2 weeks before I became more stable, and I was able to sleep, and I was able to resume my normal life. So up to this point in my life, my career had been a computer software engineer, and I had worked there for nearly 20 years. I was deeply unhappy about having had this experience, and at first I didn't want anybody to know that it had happened. I thought in some way that I was a damaged human being. It was only after I had come to the realization that I simply did not want to live my life like this anymore that I returned to my doctor and began a intensive effort at psychotherapy to try to understand what was making me so deeply unhappy and what kind of changes did I need to make in my life. I remember even at one of my most deeply depressed times, there was a therapist that I went to and told me that I was going to be like this for the rest of my life. That was really the bottom of it, and the most difficult thing. I started to get better after I had returned to my psychiatrist, wanting to understand what I needed to do in my life in order to make my life more livable and not be so incredibly unhappy. And I was definitely, since I'd been doing this for so many years, I was definitely ready to make a change in my life. My psychiatrist had fairly intensive therapy and gave me assignments to do that were difficult and wouldn't let me duck them. And at one point he asked me, "What do you do for yourself spiritually?" And I said, "Nothing." Because until that time, for many years before that, I had not been to church, even though I had grown up in a Protestant household where we went to church every Sunday. And I was involved in youth groups and so forth, but I had not been doing anything. I remember going to my doctor and telling him at one point, "I don't know where it came from, but I'm happy." And I'll never forget what he told me. What he said was, "It came from you." Pointed at me and said, "It came from you." And it was one of those moments where, you suddenly realize the way you've been looking at things maybe isn't quite what really is the real thing that's going on. Maybe there's something else that's going on. Maybe happiness comes from within, and it's not something that people give you, but it's something that you develop within yourself. And I became, happy and elated, and I thought, I don't need to take my medications anymore. And I just stopped taking them cold turkey. And what happened was that 3 weeks later, I was back in the psychiatric ward. However, this time things were much different. I was psychotic. I had not been psychotic before. I was psychotic, thinking that I had died and that the psychiatric ward was heaven where I was going to be reborn. Now, for a person with logical, scientific mind like me, that I know that sounds totally ridiculous, but in fact, in a sense, something had died. My own way of looking at myself had died. My old way of thinking of myself as a failure or as a damaged goods had died, and a new life was being reborn. And after, I think, 3 weeks in the psychiatric ward, I was put back on medications, and I came back to what we call sanity. But I was a changed person, and in fact, I knew that something religious had gone on there, and that I started going to a congregation, Unitarian Universalist congregation, not too far from where I lived, and that was very, very helpful, that community of people, and that thinking about issues that I had ignored or repressed all for those years was very, very healing for me. So my religious faith played a big role in my recovery. I have developed sort of a toolkit of things for me that work to keep me well, and that consists of making sure I get my religious practice, my spirituality, in meditation. I get my medication from my psychiatrist, which I take faithfully. I indulge in creative activities. I'm a weaver. I get enough exercise. And I'm actually running, and even in a few weeks going to run in a half marathon race. You want to take care of your entire being. Going to a mental health professional, many people have found is helpful. Many people find psychiatric medications helpful, some don't. But getting professional advice, taking care of yourself physically, making sure that you get enough sleep, enough food, enough rest for you to behave. Find something that you think is meaningful and purposeful in your life, and you will thrive when you find that. And it is possible to have a meaningful, purposeful life. And I have lots of hope for you.